The distance from the West Bank to downtown Tel Aviv is only about 16 kilometers at its narrowest point, meaning that if any hostile power was in control of the West Bank, they could utilize the high ground to bombard Israel's narrow core on the coastal plain, and they could easily advance at the narrowest point to sever Israel into two separate halves. Control over the West Bank is, geographically speaking, crucial for anybody who wants to either defend or to harm Israel. And so, ever since 1967, Israel has calculated that the damage done to their international reputation by continuing to occupy the West Bank is better than giving up their control over it to an uncertain future. And those attitudes have only hardened within Israel's Jewish population following Hamas's October 7th attack. From the Israeli perspective now, if Hamas was able to do as much damage to Israel as it did from Gaza, a hostile force in control of the West Bank, merely 16 kilometers away from Israel's biggest city, would be capable of causing even more damage. Trump himself has argued that his idea to solve the Gaza-Israel problem is different from what has been attempted for decades with no solutions. But he's really just advocating for the final culmination of American and Israeli policy towards Gaza and the Palestinians that's already existed for decades. In theory, America's foreign policy towards both Israel and Palestine for decades was based on Washington's publicly declared support for a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders of Israel, but their simultaneous, complete and uncritical support for Israel and Israeli policies on the ground that consistently made the two-state solution impossible to ever really implement. Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank continued growing, which America recognized as being illegal under international law, but also never attempted to stop or punish by withholding aid or by applying sanctions. No peace agreement or two-state solution could ever be agreed upon between the Israelis and the Palestinians, despite multiple American presidents directly trying to mediate one. The US never officially accepted Israel's annexations of occupied territories like East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, but again, it also never really did very much to stop Israel from annexing those territories either, because the rush of American money to Israel was never interrupted. Israel is, of course, by far the largest recipient of American foreign aid in history. Since Israel's founding in 1948, the United States has showered Israel with about $310 billion in foreign aid in inflation-adjusted dollars, and consistently provides $3.8 billion a year to the Israeli military. America was always very unapologetically pro-Israel, so even though when Donald Trump first became president in 2017, he was widely called the most pro-Israeli president in history, he really only began extending official American recognition to Israel's policies of occupation that had always been quietly and unofficially supported anyway. Nonetheless, during his first term in office between 2017 and 2021, Trump provided the Israelis with many diplomatic gifts that undid decades of previous official American foreign policy towards the conflict. Trump chose to relocate the American embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and in doing so, he effectively recognized all of Jerusalem as the exclusive capital of Israel, and extended American recognition of Israel's 1980 annexation of East Jerusalem, which had long been envisioned as one day becoming the capital of an independent Palestinian state. That decision effectively ended any possibility of American support for East Jerusalem ever becoming Palestinian, and it was far from Trump's only gift. Trump also extended America's recognition of Israel's 1981 annexation of the Golan Heights they occupied from Syria. But the first Trump administration also stated that they didn't view the hundreds of thousands of Jewish Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank as being in any violation of international law. In early 2020, the Trump administration also revealed another peace plan proposal for a two-state solution that virtually everybody considered was very pro-Israeli. The plan retained East Jerusalem as Israeli territory and rejected it as Palestine's capital. Israel was going to be allowed to annex roughly 30% of the West Bank's land, including all of their major settlements and the entire Jordan Valley along the border with Jordan, while the Palestinian state would have been given some much less valuable land in exchange in the Negev desert connected to Gaza. The plan would not have left the Palestinian state behind as a viable, functioning state. The West Bank part of the state would be sliced up between sovereign Israeli settlements and roads, while it would also be completely landlocked, surrounded by Israeli territory on all sides with no access to any fresh water out of the Jordan River. It would have bridges connecting it to the country of Jordan over Israeli territory and a tunnel between the West Bank and Gaza sides beneath Israeli territory. But they would also have to agree to complete demilitarization and effectively put themselves at Israel's complete mercy. The plan was rejected by the Palestinians, but it was also rejected by the Israeli Jewish Settlers Council in the West Bank, simply because it envisioned any independent Palestinian state at all. The Trump administration never ended up signing off on the Israeli annexations in the West Bank, and after the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and Trump lost the next election a few months after he proposed the deal, it died a quiet death and was never implemented. Trump spent the last several months of his first administration pursuing the Abraham Accords, his idea to basically start using the threat of Israel's looming annexations in the West Bank to start convincing various Arab states to normalize their relations with Israel in order to stop it. Using that and various other methods, Trump was able to convince the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan to all recognize Israel and normalize their relations, while he aggressively pursued the ultimate prize next, convincing Saudi Arabia to become the next one to do it, and forming what would be a powerful Israel-Saudi grand alliance in the Middle East as a bulwark against their shared rival, Iran and its proxies. After Biden assumed the presidency, he did very little to reverse any of Trump's policies towards Israel, and he took over directly where Trump left off at expanding the Abraham Accords to try and include Saudi Arabia's recognition of Israel, which culminated with Hamas's attack on Israel that was launched on October 7, 2023, that largely attempted to crush that deal from being made. The Biden administration then almost unconditionally supported Israel's retaliatory war on Hamas in Gaza that led to the Gaza Strip's current state of annihilation. The Biden administration applied very few constraints on Israel's war on Gaza. They eventually restricted the transfer of heavy 2,000-pound bombs to Israel out of concern for Israel's usage of the bombs in small and densely populated areas. And they applied a handful of sanctions on some Israeli settlers in the West Bank accused of committing violence against Palestinians there. At the same time, the Biden administration authorized nearly $18 billion of direct military aid to Israel in the period between the October 7th attack in 2023 and November of 2024, which directly contributed to Gaza's present state of ruin and the current question of what to do about that next. There were already clues that Trump's second administration is going to be even more pro-Israeli than his first administration was, and specifically, his second administration will be much more welcoming of the Israeli religious far right. These clues can be seen in many of Trump's political appointments for key diplomatic positions. For the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Trump has selected the former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, to fill the role, a very outspoken Christian Zionist who's always been publicly opposed to the two-state solution, who suggested during his own run for the presidency in 2015 that he would recognize Israel's annexation of the West Bank, and who as recently as 2024 said during a podcast interview that he didn't believe there was such a thing as the Palestinian people. For his pick of defense secretary, Trump has chosen Pete Hegseth, who as recently as 2018 delivered a speech in Jerusalem that advocated for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, and for its replacement with a third Jewish temple. And for his pick for the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Trump has selected Elise Stefanik, who during her confirmation hearing at the U.S. Senate refused to say whether or not the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, while she further said that she believes that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. On top of this, Trump also immediately reversed the few guardrails that the Biden administration had imposed on Israel to begin with. He reopened the transfer of the heavy 2,000-pound bombs to Israel again, and revoked the sanctions that had been imposed on the handful of Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank.
Representative Stefanik, it was a very simple question. I just asking you if you agree with the statement that in order to achieve long-term peace and stability in the Middle East, that we have to secure the human rights and rights to self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians. That's a yes or no?
I support human rights for all, and I think it's a disgrace that Hamas and Hezbollah have stripped human rights of the Palestinian people, and we need to ensure that we are standing up for human rights, and Israel is standing up for human rights. It is a beacon of human rights in the region.
We agree with that. I asked you in my office also about whether Palestinians have the right of self-determination. My understanding was you said yes. Do you have a different answer today?
That was not the direct question that we discussed. I said the Palestinian people...
You believe the Palestinians have the right of self-determination?
I believe the Palestinian people deserve so much better than the failures that they've had from terrorist leadership.
It's just a pretty simple question.
And I believe we need peace in the region. Of course they deserve human rights.
So...
I want to ensure that, number one, we bring the hostages home.
So do all of us. Representative Stefanik, let me just ask you. I have 30 seconds left. I'm rarely surprised by answers in my office, but I did ask you whether you subscribe to the views of Finance Minister Smotrich.
Of who? I'm sorry,
Smotrich. This is the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich and the former National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who believe that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. And in that conversation, you told me that, yes, you shared that view. Is that your view today?
Yes.
All of this, and Trump's own legacy of accommodating policies towards Israel during his first term, led to ecstatic elation among the Israeli far right after his election that during his second administration, Trump may begin again where he left off with his proposed peace plan in 2020. That will see him finally extending America's recognition of Israel's annexations of parts or all of the occupied West Bank. And this brings us back up to Trump's shocking announcement in February that the United States will be taking over and administrating the Gaza Strip after it's presumably emptied out of all of its remaining Palestinian residents by Israel. The plan has since, perhaps unsurprisingly, received fairly widespread support within Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly praised Trump's Gaza plan since it was announced alongside him, and he has said that his government in Israel is fully prepared to carry it out. Even several of Netanyahu's most significant political opponents within Israel have also praised the plan as well, including the country's former defense minister Benny Gantz and the current leader of the opposition in Israel, Yair Lapid. The day after Trump announced his Gaza plan, the National Post reported on a poll conducted in Israel which concluded that 52% of Israeli Jews supported the proposal, while only 8% of Israeli Arabs supported it. Again, showing a clear divide emerging within Israeli society on the Palestinian issue between the country's Jewish and Arab populations. And while Trump's Gaza plan has been largely welcomed by Israel, it's been resoundingly rejected by just about everybody else in the world, especially by Israel's neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. Since Trump's plan for Gaza calls for the resettlement of around 2 million Palestinians in Gaza somewhere else that's also not Israel, the only realistic places for them to go would be across the southern border into Egypt or nearby into Jordan, which for a multitude of reasons would be completely unacceptable to both nations. For one thing, there's a significant and understandable fear in both nations and in the greater Arab world at large that accepting the liquidation of Palestinians from Gaza to do the same thing to the 3 million Palestinians who live in the occupied West Bank next, potentially forcing all of them into Jordan next and destroying the decades-long Palestinian cause for nationhood once and for all. From Egypt's perspective, the entire population of the Sinai Peninsula is only around 600,000 people, meaning that if even half of Gaza's population was transferred across the border into the Sinai, it would demographically become a majority Palestinian territory. Barred from being able to return back to Gaza and forced off from their land, how likely do you think it would be that the displaced Palestinians in the Sinai would continue the fight and continue launching attacks against Israel only from Egyptian territory? I think it would be very likely, which would introduce a major new security threat for Egypt to have to deal with. A militant Palestinian insurgency developing across the Sinai would almost be a certainty that Egypt would struggle to pacify, while the presence of militant Palestinian groups operating in the Sinai would stand to eventually bring Egypt and Israel directly into conflict. It's not hard to imagine, based on Israel's previous invasions into Lebanon to stamp out displaced militant Palestinians there who were still attacking Israel, that they would also consider future invasions of the Sinai to stamp out displaced militant Palestinians there who are attacking Israel as well. Egypt is also currently a state with enormous financial and demographic problems to contend with. The country has been consumed for years by the worst financial crisis it has faced in decades, that has led to the Egyptian currency being devalued on 4 separate occasions just since 2022, with the most recent devaluation in 2024 resulting in Egypt's currency losing about 60% of its value against the US dollar. Inflation skyrocketed in Egypt and still remains high at an annualized rate of 24% as of December 2024, while the country's debt-to-GDP ratio still remains high as well at 89%. Egypt's total national debt is also forecast to continually increase through the end of the decade as well, and will probably reach more than $400 billion by 2029, and a significant amount of that debt is owed to the United States. Moreover, there's an even bigger war than the one in Gaza happening right now across Egypt's other border to the south in Sudan, a war that's already resulted in more than 1.2 million Sudanese refugees fleeing from their country to Egypt since 2023. That's already added an enormous amount of societal pressure on the Egyptian government. The threat of millions of additional Palestinian refugees being pushed into Egypt from Gaza stands to potentially become the final feather that overwhelms Egypt. It would spark fury amongst Egypt's very pro-Palestinian public after years of mounting anger rising over the country's chronic economic crisis that could lead to another revolution developing in the country that would have unpredictable results. Because of these reasons, Egypt's leader, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has threatened that Trump's Gaza plan going forward would violate Egypt's 1979 peace treaty with Israel, which could lead to a resumption in war between the two states that's remained dormant for decades now. And the concerns that Egypt has over the plan are only amplified in Jordan. Jordan received significant waves of Palestinian refugees following the events of 1948, and they granted them full citizenship, unlike in most other Arab countries where they and their descendants are still treated as perennial refugees and outsiders to this very day. Subsequent waves of Palestinian refugees to Jordan following more wars with Israel have resulted in a situation where a very significant amount of Jordan's population are already Palestinian in origin. Out of the 11 million people who live in Jordan today, 2.4 million of them are already registered as Palestinian refugees, or roughly 1 in 5 of the people who live there. Since Jordan doesn't collect official census data for how many of their total inhabitants are actually Palestinian, it's unclear how many people in total in the country are Palestinian, because the registered refugees in Jordan don't account for the Palestinians and their descendants who were granted Jordanian citizenship after the 1948 war. This is why there are some estimates out there that believe in reality, a majority of Jordan's population are already probably of Palestinian origin. On top of that, Jordan is also regarded by the UN as the second most water-stressed country in the entire world. Most of Jordan's land is an uninhabitable desert, and its 11 million people overwhelmingly live within the few areas where it actually rains just across the border from Israel and following the Jordan River. The UN defines severe water scarcity as amounting to 500 cubic meters of renewable freshwater resources per person in a country. In Jordan, that ratio is already a fifth of that, at just 100 cubic meters of renewable freshwater resources per person. So, if you relocate millions of additional Palestinians into Jordan, it would almost certainly tip the demographic balance in the country into being majority